You can't just throw him out like trash. Don't you know what he sacrificed for this country?" The young woman's voice cracked with emotion, cutting through the sterile quiet of the Pinewood Heights leasing office. Morning sunlight streamed through half-closed Venetian blinds, casting prison-bar shadows across the laminate flooring. What had started as a routine Tuesday morning had quickly descended into something else entirely. Mr. Jenkins stood quietly at the counter, weathered hands trembling slightly as they clutched the eviction notice. His faded blue cardigan hung loosely on his thin frame, and his eyes, clear but tired, remained fixed on the property manager seated behind the desk. At 8-2, he'd faced far worse than this, but the indignity still stung. "I understand you're upset, Ms. Torres, but corporate policy is very clear," said Diane Larson, the newly appointed regional property manager. Her manicured fingers tapped impatiently on her keyboard. 3 consecutive late payments trigger automatic eviction proceedings. "We've been more than accommodating." The small office felt increasingly claustrophobic. 2 other residents waiting for their appointments shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The young maintenance worker by the water cooler suddenly found the floor fascinating. Nobody wanted to get involved. "It's only been 3 days, mister." Jenkins finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. "The VA benefits were delayed this month. I've never missed a payment in 7 years." Ms. Larson's expression didn't change. "Policy is policy, Mr. Jenkins. We're upgrading all units in your section, and frankly, we need to ensure all tenants can consistently meet their obligations." She slid a printed sheet across the counter. "You have 72 hours to vacate the premises. All your belongings must be removed by Friday at 9 a.m. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The automated air freshener in the corner released a mechanical puff of synthetic lavender. Outside, through the plate glass window, residents went about their morning routines, unaware of the quiet devastation unfolding inside. Mr. Jenkins carefully folded the eviction notice with military precision, his gnarled fingers creasing the paper with practiced movements. He tucked it into his breast pocket, right next to something small and metallic that glinted momentarily in the sunlight. Without another word, he turned to leave, shoulders squared despite the slight stoop of age. "This is wrong, and you know it," Ms. Torres said, stepping forward to take the elderly man's arm supportively. "He's lived here longer than you've worked for this company." Ms. Larson's smile was professionally empty. "If you have concerns about our policies, there's a feedback form on our website. Now, unless you have leasing business to discuss, I'll have to ask you both to leave. I have other appointments waiting." Behind them, the office phone began to ring. Franklin Jenkins had called Pinewood Heights home for the past 7 years, ever since his wife Margaret passed away. At 8'2", his once powerful frame had grown lean, but he carried himself with the same dignity he'd maintained throughout his life. His silver hair was neatly combed, and despite the early hour, he was dressed in pressed khaki slacks and a button-down shirt beneath his cardigan. The slight limp in his right leg became more pronounced when the weather changed, a souvenir from his time in Vietnam that he never discussed. The small one-bedroom apartment on the ground floor wasn't much, just 650 square feet of living space, but Mr. Jenkins had made it his own. Photographs lined the walls, tracing the arc of a life well-lived. Franklin in his marine dress blues, standing tall and proud. Franklin and Margaret on their wedding day, their son Robert in his own military uniform before he was deployed to Afghanistan, where he would later fall in service to his country. Each morning, Mr. Jenkins would rise at 0500 hours, make his bed with hospital corners, and brew exactly 1 cup of coffee, which he would drink while watching the sun rise from his small patio. Neighbors knew him as the quiet gentleman who collected their packages when they were away, who remembered everyone's birthdays with handwritten cards, and who taught the building's children how to properly fold an American flag. What most didn't know was that the unassuming elderly man had once led a platoon through some of the fiercest fighting of the Vietnam War, earning a Silver Star for valor that now sat in a small wooden box in his dresser drawer, alongside a Purple Heart and the folded flag from his son's funeral. Diane Larson had been the regional property manager for Everest Property Holdings for exactly 11 months. At 36, she had already developed the firm efficiency that corporate leadership prized above all else. Her tailored pantsuit and severe bob projected the image she wanted, a woman who couldn't be bothered with excuses. She had taken over management of 6 properties, including Pinewood Heights, With a mandate to improve value metrics and optimize tenant demographics, corporate speak for raising rents and attracting younger, wealthier residents. Ms. Larson's desk was immaculate, with color-coded folders arranged in perfect alignment. The only personal touch was a small framed award for excellence in property management from her previous position. She approached tenant relations the same way she approached everything else, as a problem to be solved with the proper application of policy. Exceptions created inefficiency, and inefficiency was the enemy of quarterly performance bonuses. What Ms. Larson didn't know, or perhaps chose not to acknowledge, was that Pinewood Heights had originally been developed with certain tax incentives specifically for providing affordable housing for veterans. The previous manager had understood this unspoken mission, working with residents like Mr. Jenkins when bureaucratic delays at the VA occasionally affected benefit payments. But that manager had been replaced, deemed too flexible, by corporate leadership eager to capitalize on the neighborhood's rising property values. Comment, honor our heroes, if you believe those who serve deserve respect and dignity in their elder years. Outside the leasing office, Maria Torres placed a steadying hand on Mr. Jenkins' arm. At 28, she was one of the few younger residents who had gotten to know the older tenants in the building. A third-grade teacher at the local elementary school, she had moved to Pinewood Heights 3 years ago, attracted by the affordable rent and quiet community. "You can't let them do this, Mr. Jenkins," she insisted, her dark eyes flashing with indignation. "There has to be some kind of protection for tenants, especially for veterans." Mr. Jenkins patted her hand gently. "It's all right, Maria. I've weathered worse storms." "No, it's not all right," she countered, pulling out her phone. "My cousin works for legal aid. Let me call him." Before she could dial, the leasing office door opened, and Ms. Larson emerged, a thin folder in her hands. "Mr. Jenkins," she called, her voice professionally modulated. "I've just received an email from corporate. Apparently, there's a grace period option that might be applicable to your situation." Her tone made it clear this was an unwelcome complication to her morning. Inside the office again, Mr. Jenkins stood ramrod straight as Ms. Larson reluctantly explained. "You can apply for a 7-day extension, provided you pay a processing fee of $150 and sign this acknowledgement of violation." She slid a form across the counter. "However, this is a one-time accommodation. Any future late payments will result in immediate eviction without possibility of extension." Maria, who had followed them back inside, couldn't contain herself. "A processing fee? For being 3 days late? That's predatory." Ms. Larson's smile tightened. "As I explained, this is corporate policy for all Everest property holdings. We manage over 15,000 units nationwide, and standardized procedures are essential for operational efficiency." Mr. Jenkins studied the form silently, the fluorescent light reflecting off his reading glasses. "This says I must pay the fee in addition to a late penalty of $75. "That's correct," Ms. Larson replied. "The total due today would be $1,025, your regular rent of $800, plus the late fee and processing charge." The elderly veteran reached into his pocket and withdrew a worn leather wallet. "I can pay the rent and late fee now. The VA benefits were deposited this morning. But this processing fee..." He hesitated. "That would leave me short for medications this month." Ms. Larson's expression didn't change. "The fee is non-negotiable. If you can't meet the full payment requirements today, I'll need to proceed with the eviction as scheduled." Maria stepped forward. "This is ridiculous. He's never been late before. 7 years of perfect payments, and you're going to evict him over a processing fee." "Ms. Torres, this doesn't concern you," Ms. Larson said coldly. "Unless you're offering to pay the fee yourself." Mr. Jenkins raised a calming hand. "It's all right, Maria." From his wallet, he withdrew a bank card that trembled slightly in his weathered fingers. "I'll manage somehow." As Ms. Larson processed the payment, Mr. Jenkins removed something else from his wallet, a faded photograph protected by a plastic sleeve. He placed it carefully on the counter. The image showed a group of young Marines, mud-splattered and exhausted but standing proud, somewhere in the Vietnamese jungle. "My unit," he said quietly. "3rd Battalion, 4th Marines. 1968. Ms. Larson glanced at the photograph with perfunctory politeness. "How nice. If you could sign here, please." Maria stared at the property manager in disbelief. "Do you have any idea what these men went through? What they sacrificed?" "Ms. Torres," Ms. Larson said, her patience visibly wearing thin. "I respect military service as much as anyone, but business is business. If Mr. Jenkins wants to remain in his apartment, these are the terms. A small crowd had gathered in the waiting area, other residents who had overheard the commotion. A middle-aged man in a postal uniform shook his head disgustedly. An elderly woman clutched her purse tightly, eyes wide with concern. The maintenance worker had disappeared, presumably to avoid being drawn into the conflict. Mr. Jenkins signed the form with a steady hand, the same hand that had once pulled wounded comrades to safety under enemy fire. The same hand that had accepted medals from grateful commanders, and later, a folded flag at his son's funeral. "Will there be anything else?" he asked quietly. Ms. Larson's computer chimed as the payment processed. "That's all for now. Remember, this accommodation is a one-time exception. Next month, the office door swung open with such force that the blinds rattled against the glass. The maintenance worker had returned, but he wasn't alone. The maintenance worker stood aside as a towering figure filled the doorway. Colonel James Harrington of the United States Marine Corps entered the leasing office with the commanding presence that came from 27 years of military service. His dress blues were immaculate, ribbons and medals creating a mosaic of service across his broad chest. At 6'3", he seemed to make the room smaller simply by existing within it. Behind him, 2 Marine officers in service uniforms flanked the entrance, their posture perfect, expressions impassive. Through the office windows, 3 black SUVs with government plates could be seen parked directly in front of the building, hazard lights flashing. A small crowd of residents had begun to gather outside, drawn by the unexpected arrival of what was clearly an official military delegation. The room fell into stunned silence. Ms. Larson rose halfway from her chair, mouth slightly open, the eviction paperwork forgotten in her hands. Colonel Harrington's gaze swept the room before settling on Mr. Jenkins. Something flashed across his face, recognition, respect, and something deeper. Without hesitation, he strode across the room and came to attention directly in front of the elderly veteran. "Sergeant Major Franklin Jenkins," he said, voice resonant with formal gravity. "3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, Kilo Company." He rendered a perfect salute. "Sir, it is an honor to stand in your presence." The transformation in Mr. Jenkins was immediate and striking. Age seemed to fall away as he straightened to his full height, shoulders squaring with muscle memory that transcended time. He returned the salute with precision, his weathered hand steady at his brow. "At ease, Colonel," he said quietly, though there was new strength in his voice. "It's been a long time since anyone addressed me by rank." "Too long, Sergeant Major. Far too long." The colonel lowered his hand. "Permission to embrace a hero, sir?" Mr. Jenkins nodded, emotion visible in his eyes, and the 2 Marines, separated by generations but united by the sacred bond of the Corps, embraced briefly. Ms. Larson cleared her throat. "Excuse me, but we're in the middle of a tenant proceeding. If you could please, ma'am. I'm Colonel James Harrington, Deputy Commander of Marine Corps Base Quantico, and son of Lieutenant William Harrington, Kilo Company, 1968. His tone was polite, but left no room for interruption. "And I'm here on official business concerning Sergeant Major Jenkins in this property." One of the Marines who had entered with the colonel stepped forward, placing a leather portfolio on the counter. "Ms. Larson, we have documentation you'll want to review immediately." Outside, more vehicles were arriving, 2 white-based security cars and a staff car with Marine Corps flags on the fenders. The growing crowd of residents watched in amazement as uniformed personnel established a perimeter around the leasing office. "I don't understand," Ms. Larson stammered, genuine confusion replacing her earlier bureaucratic certainty. "What is this about?" Colonel Harrington gestured to the portfolio. "That contains several items of interest. First, confirmation that Sergeant Major Jenkins' VA benefits were processed on schedule but misdirected by your corporate office's new payment system. Second, documentation verifying that this property was developed under the Veterans Housing Initiative of 2009, which prohibits exactly the kind of punitive fees you're attempting to impose on a decorated combat veteran. And third, paperwork initiating a full compliance review of all Everest Property Holdings veterans' housing practices." The maintenance worker, who had remained by the door, spoke up. "When I heard what was happening to Mr. Jenkins, I called my cousin at Quantico. I didn't know he'd bring the whole sorry, sir, the whole Marine Corps with him." "And we're grateful for the call, Santiago," the colonel replied. "The Corps takes care of its own, always has, always will." From outside came the sound of more vehicles arriving. Through the windows, residents could see what appeared to be a mobile command center being established in the parking lot. Two Marines in dress blues were now carefully removing the Everest Property Holdings sign from the front of the building. Ms. Larson's face had gone pale. This is highly irregular. I'll need to contact corporate legal immediately. By all means, Colonel Harrington said smoothly, though they're likely already aware of the situation. My understanding is that the Secretary of Veterans Affairs has personally made a call to your CEO. He turned to address the small crowd that had formed in the leasing office. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. I'd like to introduce you all to Sergeant Major Franklin Jenkins. The colonel's voice took on a different timbre, the kind used when delivering a citation. On April 17, 1968, then Staff Sergeant Jenkins led a recovery mission into heavily contested territory after a helicopter crash. Under intense enemy fire, he personally extracted 4 wounded Marines and the body of a fallen comrade. Among those he saved was my father, Lieutenant William Harrington. Ms. Larson sank slowly back into her chair, the full weight of the situation finally registering on her face. The man you've been attempting to evict, Colonel Harrington continued, is the recipient of the Silver Star for Valor, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Combat V. He later served as Sergeant Major for the entire 4th Marine Regiment. He turned to face Ms. Larson directly. And today, he's been disrespected in a building that exists specifically to honor veterans like him. The leasing office had transformed into something resembling a military briefing room. The documents from the colonel's portfolio were now spread across the counter, some bearing official Department of Defense letterheads, others the insignia of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Ms. Larson stared at them, the color slowly returning to her face as comprehension dawned. This property, Colonel Harrington explained, pointing to a highlighted section on one document, was developed using federal tax incentives specifically designed to provide affordable housing for veterans. In exchange for those incentives, Everest Property Holdings agreed to certain conditions, including grace periods for VA benefit processing delays and prohibitions against punitive fees for service-connected payment issues. One of the colonel's aides handed him another document. This is the original agreement signed by your CEO 6 years ago. As you can see, it explicitly states that no veteran can be evicted without a minimum 30-day notice period and multiple attempts at resolution. Ms. Larson swallowed hard. I was never informed of these special conditions. That's not a defense recognized under federal housing law. The colonel replied evenly, especially when the violations involve a decorated combat veteran who saved the lives of his fellow Marines at great personal risk. From outside came the sound of car doors slamming. Through the windows, the gathered residents could see more official vehicles arriving. A woman in a dark suit emerged from one, flanked by 2 uniformed officers wearing JAG Corps insignia. That would be the Inspector General's office, the colonel noted. They take housing discrimination against veterans quite seriously these days. Maria Torres, who had remained beside Mr. Jenkins throughout the confrontation, spoke up. Will Mr. Jenkins be able to stay in his apartment? Sergeant Major Jenkins, the colonel corrected gently, will not only remain in his apartment, but his rent will be adjusted to the correct veteran's rate, which appears to have been improperly calculated for some time. He turned to Ms. Larson. By my estimation, he's been overcharged approximately $125 per month for the past 11 months. That's $1,375, plus interest. Ms. Larson's professional composure was crumbling rapidly. I just implement the rates set by corporate. And yet you were quite prepared to implement an eviction without proper understanding of the legal framework governing this property, the colonel observed. Sergeant Major Jenkins wasn't the only veteran facing these punitive measures, was he? The maintenance worker, Santiago, stepped forward. There's at least 6 other vets in the complex, sir. Mr. Ramirez and 14B got the same notice last month. Had to borrow money from his daughter to cover the fees. The colonel nodded grimly. We'll need the names of all veterans currently residing in Everest Properties, MS. Larson. Immediately. Outside, the military presence had completely transformed the normally quiet apartment complex. Marines in dress blues stood at parade rest near the entrances while officers conversed with groups of curious and increasingly hopeful residents. The mobile command center had set up a table where residents were now lining up, papers in hand. A young lieutenant entered the office and saluted Colonel Harrington. Sir, we've established contact with veterans in buildings B through D. Initial reports indicate systematic application of unauthorized fees and accelerated eviction proceedings against at least 9 veterans in this complex alone. Thank you, Lieutenant. Coordinate with Captain Reynolds to gather all relevant documentation. The colonel turned back to Ms. Larson. I believe we'll be extending our investigation to all Everest properties in the state. The transformation in Mr. Jenkins was remarkable. Though he still stood with the slight stoop of age, there was new life in his eyes and strength in his bearing. Residents who had known him only as the quiet elderly man in apartment 103 were now looking at him with newfound respect as they learned of his distinguished service. I never wanted special treatment, Mr. Jenkins said quietly to the colonel. Just the dignity of being able to live out my days in peace. You earned more than you ever received, Sergeant Major, the colonel replied. My father told me stories about your leadership in Vietnam. He said there wasn't a man in Kilo Company who wouldn't have followed you into hell itself. He gestured toward the window. That's why these Marines are here today. The Corps doesn't forget its heroes. Ms. Larson, now visibly shaken, attempted to regain some control of the situation. I'll need to contact my regional director about all of this. By all means, the colonel said, though I believe he's currently in a meeting with federal housing investigators. He nodded to one of his aides, who produced an official-looking document and placed it on the desk. This is an emergency cease and desist order temporarily halting all eviction proceedings against veterans in Everest properties pending full investigation. Another aide stepped forward with a second document. And this is an official notice of non-compliance with federal veterans housing regulations. As of 0900 hours this morning, this leasing office is closed for operations until further notice. The colonel turned to address the gathered residents. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption to your day. A temporary housing assistance center is being established in the community room to address any concerns during this transition period. Mr. Jenkins reached into his pocket and withdrew the payment receipt from earlier. What about the fees I just paid? The colonel smiled. Those will be refunded immediately, Sergeant Major. With interest. By evening, Pinewood Heights had transformed. The military presence had scaled back, but their impact remained. The leasing office door bore an official notice, temporarily closed pending federal investigation. The black SUVs had departed, but 2 military police vehicles remained stationed in the parking lot. Ms. Larson had been escorted from the premises 3 hours earlier, carrying a small box of personal belongings. Her face, drained of color, avoided the gazes of residents who watched in silence as she hurried to her car. The corporate headquarters of Everest Property Holdings had issued an emergency statement announcing her administrative leave pending internal review and promising full cooperation with federal investigators. In the community room, a makeshift command center continued to assist veterans from across the complex. Mr. Ramirez from 14B emerged with tears in his eyes, clutching papers confirming the refund of fees he'd been forced to pay. Similar scenes played out as other veterans discovered they would receive compensation for years of overcharges. Mr. Jenkins sat on his small patio, watching the sunset. Colonel Harrington had stayed behind after his unit departed, sharing coffee and memories of the colonel's father. On the table between them lay Mr. Jenkins' silver star, removed from its box for the first time in decades. Dad would have been here himself if he could, the colonel said. He never forgot what you did for him. We took care of each other, Mr. Jenkins replied simply. That's what Marines do. News of the day's events spread quickly through the community. As evening fell, residents began appearing at Mr. Jenkins' door, some with home-cooked meals, others simply wanting to shake his hand or share a word of thanks. Maria Torres organized a schedule to ensure the sergeant major had transportation to his medical appointments. Santiago promised regular maintenance checks that wouldn't require official requests. By the following morning, local news crews had arrived to cover the story. Everest Property Holdings stock had dropped 11 points overnight. The Department of Veterans Affairs announced a nationwide review of corporate-owned veteran housing properties. 3 other management companies with similar portfolios voluntarily announced reviews of their own policies, eager to avoid similar scrutiny. Mr. Jenkins' routine didn't change. He still rose at 0500, made his bed with hospital corners, and brewed exactly 1 cup of coffee. But now, as he sat watching the sunrise, the weight of invisibility had lifted. The quiet dignity that had always been there was now recognized and honored by those around him. Sometimes the most unassuming among us carry the heaviest medals. Remember that the elderly man at the grocery store, the quiet neighbor who keeps to himself, or the homeless person on the corner may have once stood between you and danger, sacrificing more than you can imagine. Our veterans deserve our respect, not just on designated holidays, but every day. Look around you. Heroes walk among us, often in silence.